I'm Jonathan Larsen with TYTI Investigates, and we're going to be talking today about Ukraine. Not what Trump's people did regarding Ukraine, what witnesses testify they heard about Ukraine so much as what's actually going on in Ukraine. We heard in congressional testimony yesterday from two people from the State Department, an ambassador and I believe a deputy undersecretary, that they care about Ukraine. They care about Ukraine clearly for personal reasons. They've been there and seen they've seen the toll that the conflict has taken there. It's above 13,000 fatalities at this point. They've literally seen, Russian weaponry aimed at them, and they also understand that Ukraine, in one of the pieces I read, Ukraine is described as being the Berlin Wall of Europe at the moment. The difference, of course, there being that the Berlin Wall was meant to keep people in, and at this point, it's more of a defensive bulwark. So I do want to caution you that I am not an expert on Ukraine, and I did not even stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. However, one more point. What I want to break down today doesn't necessarily come with easy good guys and bad guys. It's not going to end with a call for action or tell you who to hate. The point, I think, is to understand one thing that gets overlooked a lot whenever the U.S. becomes concerned with or interested in foreign policy. We tend to forget that there are domestic forces that affect how other national leaders act, what they do. So today is less of a barn burner for going out and saving the world than it is, I hope, a little bit of a look at how things are complicated over there, but also the fact that something is going on right now, and to examine a little bit how what Ambassador Taylor described yesterday as this bifurcation of diplomacy into the official standard channel, which operated through protocol and all that, and the alternate informal off the books channel, and how it matters not just what that off the books channel does, but the fact that it exists. So I want to get to a really good New York Times article, which just came out this morning and I think is really important and is getting totally overlooked, mostly I think because so many people are either engaging in or trying to take a dump on, admirably, and I did it myself on Twitter this morning, this whole notion that the impeachment hearings are boring. They lack pizzazz. And that's just a toxic way of even thinking about impeachment hearings, let alone a horrific use of news resources to assign that topic to someone and pay someone decent money, good money in a lot of these cases, to waste a single brain cell on that. For me to understand the New York Times article a little better, I had to go back and do some supplementary reading, which is what I'm going to do today, is walk you through some of what's going on, and then we'll get to where Ukraine is right now and what they're working towards. There's something actually going on in Ukraine at this moment that they are trying to do, and whether it's good or bad remains unclear. And Russia, by the way, is involved. This involves Putin very much. But let's start with last month. So I'm going to start with an opinion piece by Leonid Bershitsky in Bloomberg, and I want to read you a few choice pieces from it, just as background. Right now, Ukraine is hoping to reinitiate bilateral peace talks with Russia. Russia doesn't necessarily want them to be bilateral because Russia, essentially, don't forget, denies being in the Donbass. That's the eastern Ukrainian region where the Russian allied separatists, armed by, funded by, supported by Russia, that's the region that they currently occupy. Russia is like, well, we're not doing that, so why would we be in one-on-one talks? So reading from the column now, both sides Ukraine and Russia, actually want to end the conflict, and we'll get to why Russia does in a moment, and share the goal of having the Kiev government reestablish sovereignty over the regions in eastern Ukraine now held by pro-Moscow separatists. That's a good thing. That's a positive thing. Both sides are invested in ending the conflict, and they have some degree of consensus on at least the ostensible notion of Ukrainian sovereignty over the Donbass. Now, the foreign minister of Ukraine, it says, I'm missing her. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, this is not the foreign minister. We'll get to him later. This is the president, Volodymyr Zelensky. Reading from the column. Zelensky predictably got into trouble at home because he accepted a key Russian demand known as the Steinmeier formula. The formula says the separatist-held areas, the Donbass, should get a special autonomous status under Ukrainian law immediately after the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe recognizes the outcome of a local election. So basically, Russia wants the Donbass to get not be separate, but have a greater deal of autonomy. Sort of, to choose a provocative example, sort of like Hong Kong, I suppose, and China. And what they're saying is this would happen after an outside observers would certify a local election to make sure, basically, that Russia hadn't had their thumb on the scale of the election. The idea being, of course, that Russia would want its people to win that election. Opponents of this plan, which Zelensky is basically suggested he's open to, giving them autonomy after the elections. Opponents include Zelensky's predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, about whom, who is considered not exactly super clean, and the well-armed veterans of the East Ukraine War. So this is a significant domestic. Remember I talked about how domestic policy and forces shape what the current leadership of other countries amounts to. Zelensky is dealing with a lot of veterans who have very staunch feelings about not giving up anything to Russia. They say an election in the Donbass, that's the separatist region, is only possible after Russia restores to Ukraine the control of its eastern border. In other words, their position is, how can you hold a real election without letting the country that runs the place run the place? For the Kremlin, this condition means Ukrainians may try to arrest its supporters in eastern Ukraine before the election and before they're subject to an amnesty stipulated in Ukraine's law. So basically, Ukraine is saying, well, if you're given full autonomy over the region, full control, then you're just going to round up all the people friendly to us. So why would we wait for that to happen? Let everyone vote. Again, I'm not suggesting that there are clear and easy answers here. Here's where we get to the foreign minister, Vadim Prystaiko. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. Prystaiko has named 3 distinct Ukrainian red lines. In other words, Zelensky is under pressure from veterans at home not to capitulate too much to Putin. And his foreign minister, Prystaiko, has said there are 3 things that are red lines for us, lines we will not cross. These are things we will not give up. 1, Eastern Territories' autonomy shouldn't turn Ukraine, which is now a unitary state, into a federation. 2, Ukraine won't change its constitution to incorporate expanded rights for these territories. One of the things Russia is pushing for is literally for Ukraine to change its form of government at a fundamental level, which is not a thing you usually hear in peace talks. And the Kremlin argument here, of course, is we want to make sure that these people have, maximal rights within their autonomous region. We'll get to why they want that if you haven't figured it out already, because it's not super tough. And 3, elections will be held only after all Russian troops are withdrawn, pro-Russian military units disbanded, and control of the border handed back to Ukraine. So that's what Zelensky last month was saying. These are our red lines. Finishing up the column here, Bershitsky writes, what's important for Putin is to make sure Kremlin-friendly forces prevail in the eastern Ukrainian election. So those 3 red lines that Zelensky has, those are essentially holding the line against measures that would tip the scale in Ukrainian elections towards Putin allies. Making sure Kremlin-friendly forces prevail in the eastern Ukraine election would give Putin enough leverage in a reunited Ukraine to give up the People's Republics. That outcome can be assured by finding a balance between giving Zelensky enough control to pacify the domestic opposition, but not enough control to take the pro-Russian leaders out of the running. So here's the calculus that Putin appears to be making. Putin is basically willing to say, I will give you back this land, but in return, I get enough of my people and enough avenues for my people to participate in the government that that I can be assured, he wouldn't necessarily say this publicly, of the opportunity to influence Ukraine's future and how the Ukraine's path forward. So rather than take solitary, sole exclusive control of the Donbass, Putin is saying, I'll give that back to you, but your overall control of the country diminishes somewhat because you have to open the doors to reforms that would let me and my people get some control. So his net control over Ukraine arguably stays the same, potentially even grows better. It's just no longer concentrated in the Donbass. That was last month. A couple days ago, Andrew Kramer writes in the New York Times that on Tuesday, we learned that Zelensky has reached out for a direct meeting with Putin. And I think I explained earlier the reasoning for a direct meeting. Right now, the talks are overseen by France and Germany, but Mr. Zelensky had pressed for a more robust American role, in part by seeking a meeting with President Trump in the White House. So this really is important, right? Because one of the conditions that was placed on one of the things that the White House, Trump White House, used as leverage was the fact that Zelensky wanted a meeting with Trump, right? It wasn't just the aid, it was also the meeting. Those were the 2 things that Sondland, Taylor, everyone who's testified has said were on the table. That was what, those were the points of leverage that Trump had. And we understood immediately, right, the value of military aid. It's to shoot back at the people shooting at you. But now we understand how profound the importance of the face-to-face meeting was as well. Prior to this, it appeared that Zelensky just wanted what most leaders want, which is the prestige and the attention and the legitimization that come with a White House meeting, whoever the White House occupant might be. Now we know that part of Zelensky's reason for wanting to meet with Trump was to bring Trump into the process. In other words, Zelensky face-to-face with Putin is dwarfed, right? There's a huge power imbalance there. Bringing the US into the equation means that Ukraine has a stronger position at the peace talks table. So this is not a symbolic thing. It's not for his own prestige. This was just like the military aid about defending Ukraine. That's why they wanted the meeting. And that makes denying the meeting more problematic, shall we say, to be kind. Now, here's the problem. Here's where we get to how not just the impeachment, but the Trump 2-channel approach has affected things. Since September, that's only 2 months ago, 5 American officials who dealt with Ukraine have resigned. A former president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, said on Tuesday, he's the guy who told us about Zelensky seeking the one-on-one meetings. According to the Times, quote, Nazarbayev, quote, suggested that Russia was not seeking to seize territory, but rather to trade its de facto occupation of Ukrainian land for other things. Now, Nazarbayev is a go-between between the Kremlin and Kiev. So he's not pulling this out of nowhere. This is someone who's dealing with both sides. Putin wants other things. He's not just going to walk out of the Donbass. He wants things in return. Continuing from the Times piece, most analysts say Russia, which arms and supports the separatist rebels who control parts of eastern Ukraine, wants changes to Ukraine's domestic political system that would give Moscow a greater say over the country's affairs. Again, he's talking about a trade-off between 100% or close to it concentrated power to diminished power, but that's throughout the country by weakening whatever barriers there are. And he might be right that maybe they're unfair barriers, maybe they're not. Again, I did not stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. The Kremlin has delayed the French and German-led talks as it demanded ever more concessions. In other words, Zelensky has been making concessions. This is what's angering the Ukrainian veterans. And as Zelensky does so, Putin continues to seek more concessions. And why can he do that? Because not only is Trump being diffident about helping Ukraine, but the people charged with helping Ukraine in the US, they're not even at their desks anymore. Mr. Zelensky agreed to a Russian-approved political formula. That's the formula I was talking about earlier. Now I'm blanking on the name already. Steinmeier formula. Mr. Zelensky agreed to the Steinmeier formula for settlement and withdrew troops from the fronts in some locations, even pulling back some troops under fire, something Zelensky had said he would not do. John Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, says of Putin, quote, he keeps raising the price because he sees that Zelensky is interested. There are limits, however, he says, to the price Zelensky is willing to pay. And here's where we get to one of those limits, and this is the one we talked about already. One limit is domestic opposition. Concessions are inflaming Ukrainian nationalists, largely dominated by those veterans I talked about, who deride Zelensky's policies as capitulation. On a trip to a western Ukrainian city earlier this month, Zelensky was met by a crowd chanting, "Shame, shame," for caving into Russia's demands. Some Russians also see the concessions as signs of weakness. Sorry, let me reemphasize that. Some Russians also see the concessions, Zelensky's concessions, as signs of weakness from a Ukrainian president whose hopes for American support have evaporated. In other words, Putin's already getting things he wanted out of Zelensky as a result of Zelensky's support being weakened in the US by the US. Konstantin Gaz, a politics professor at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Science, said, quote, Putin is not saying directly that Ukraine will have to negotiate because it lost support in the West, but he could say that. In other words, Putin's not making a point of that, right? Because why would he? Why would he draw attention to the fact that this is all helping him when that would galvanize forces to stop it? So, here's where we get to the New Times article today by Anton Troyanovsky, I believe a Moscow correspondent for the Times, writing today. He's got a great, and it's Dateline Kiev, he's there. He's got a great lead that I want to read to you. Ukrainians are used to hearing the West call for stability in their country. This fall, the roles have reversed. Quote, Ukraine would very much like to see a stable political situation in the states, Alexander Turchinov, the previous Ukrainian president's national security advisor, said in an interview, quote, the relationship between Kiev and Washington, Turchinov added, quote, is a question of life and death for us. Talking about Putin, it says, he wants to end the war on his terms, and thanks to the disarray in American policy in Ukraine, politicians and officials in Kiev say, the chances of that are improving. In other words, we may get a ceasefire, but the terms of that ceasefire are going to be tilted measurably towards Putin and away from Ukraine and away from Europe, precisely because of what the Times piece refers to as the disarray in American policy. And it's not entirely wrong to say that the impeachment proceedings are a part of that, right? The fact that impeachment proceedings are even happening is a part of what's making things more unsettled regarding Ukraine policy. But that's a result of the creation of the two channels, right? We've heard a lot recently, both here at TYTI Daily, but also now in the testimony, about the two channels. There's the official diplomatic channel that the US has with Ukraine, envoys, diplomats, ambassadors. Then there's the unofficial channel, which consists of people like the president's personal lawyer. And here's the really vital point about this that I want to make, which is once you establish a second channel, you win. You don't need that second channel to achieve the goals that you ask for it. The very existence of a second channel means that now the people on the other end, the folks in the government you're dealing with, they now no longer know who to talk to. They no longer know whether what channel A tells them will be upheld by channel B or vice versa. In other words, the relationships between the two countries become paralyzed. They're in a form of stasis where the other country doesn't know what to do and can't count on anything that's told it by either channel. And so if your goal is to undermine Ukraine and diminish American support for it, the American channel doesn't have to do a thing. They don't have to win. They just have to exist. Ukrainian lawmaker Bohdan Yaremenko says, quote, "We are not interested in any chaos within the United States political system because we are really, really relying on it." In other words, they're saying, you guys, we need you to be stable. We need you to be reliable. Less American engagement in Ukraine, Mr. Yaremenko said, would offer Russia, quote, "a clear sign that they could allow themselves more in Ukraine, to be more aggressive, more active." In the past, this is the Times now, American diplomats worked closely with Kiev in any talks with Moscow. They presented a united front to the Kremlin, cajoled the European Union to maintain sanctions, and tried to reassure a nervous Ukrainian public. Kurt Volker, the State Department Special Envoy for Ukraine, whose testimony we've talked about here, traveled to the country frequently, held talks with Russian officials, and agitated on behalf of Kiev at the White House, on Capitol Hill, and in Europe. But with American policy and personnel scrambled by revelations about Mr. Trump's push for Ukraine to investigate Democrats, the United States is now largely absent, and this is not the Times saying it, from the political and diplomatic process over resolving the war in the East, Ukrainian and Western officials in Kiev say. Since this spring, as Mr. Trump's pressure campaign built towards its highest pitch, at least 9 officials who had a hand in Ukraine policy have either resigned or become distanced from the Trump administration after testifying in the impeachment inquiry. In other words, it's not just those 5 who have resigned. Anyone who's cooperated with investigators is now cut off from the Trump administration, meaning you've now got potentially 3 channels. You've got the informal channel, the formal channel, and then the people in the formal channel who are now cut off. Here are the 9. Mr. Volker, who we already mentioned, the envoy to Ukraine. John Bolton, former National Security Advisor. Fiona Hill, former advisor on Europe and Russia at the White House, National Security Council. Marie Yovanovitch, the former ambassador to Ukraine, gone. Michael McKinley, senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the top Ukraine expert at the National Security Council, and diplomats Gordon Sondland, Ambassador Bill Taylor, and George P. Kent, the Deputy Undersecretary. Only Mr. Taylor is still active in Ukraine, serving as the acting United States ambassador. On Wednesday, Mr. Taylor testified to the Intelligence Committee, which is leading the impeachment inquiry, that his aide was told in July that Mr. Trump cared more about investigations of Biden than he did about Ukraine. And now, Ukrainian and Western officials in Kiev say they doubt that Mr. Taylor speaks for Trump. In other words, he's the highest ranking guy left, and they don't believe him. Again, he's now in that, 3rd channel. People who are in the formal channel, but have been totally cut off at the knees. Oksana Syroid, who heads a Ukrainian political party called Self-Reliance, which supports closer ties with Washington, told the Times, quote, Americans were, quote, providing this backup and legitimacy of the Ukrainian position. now, unquote, now with the expanding cloud of controversy around U.S.-Ukraine relations, Ukraine is, quote, kind of naked, she said. Quote, we are alone confronting Russia. And there's one point I really, really want to get to, but it's going to have to wait. I'm going to skip this part, I think. Right, okay. Siroid says she believes both Democrats and Republicans are now thinking twice about even communicating with Ukrainians for fear of being bound up in the impeachment maelstrom. Some officials in Kiev said Ukraine had become toxic in Washington. Ukrainians are now baffled about whom they should speak with in Washington. So you can have three channels, 4 channels, 5 channels. As long as there's more than one channel, no one knows who to talk to or who to listen to. Right now, there is no one, said Turchinov, the former national security advisor in Ukraine, I said. There is no one, he said, who knows in detail the situation in Ukraine and can at any moment give advice, consult, have our back, and pass on objective information about events happening in the country to the highest political level in America. The United States of America, the most powerful country today and in world history, has no one, not a single person, currently active that Ukraine can count on and reach in a moment to be authoritative about advice and debriefings about what the U.S. position is on whatever might happen. No one. And what I said earlier about the about Taylor testified, right, that his aides said Trump cared more about investigations of Biden than he did about Ukraine. That statement, I'm not saying Taylor shouldn't have made it, but the fact that that is true is a gift to Putin. And I don't mean to suggest Putin's got a P-tape on Trump or anything like that. I'm not going there. I'm just talking about the actual material impact on Ukraine at the moment. Quote from the Times piece. The shadow cast onto Ukraine by the impeachment process has not gone unnoticed in Moscow. The revelations about the Trump administration's pressure campaign back up a core element of the Kremlin's propaganda about American involvement in Ukraine, specifically that faraway Washington only sees Ukraine as a means to its own ends, without caring for the well-being of regular Ukrainians. So the Times refers to that as Kremlin propaganda. The Kremlin is telling Ukrainians, who it is working very hard right now to influence and persuade, that Washington, your ally, they don't care about you except as a chess piece, as a pawn. It's in that environment that we hear that U.S. officials, insiders, not career diplomats, are telling each other that Trump does not care about Ukraine, confirming what the Times refers to as propaganda, but appears to be dead-on truth. Quote, many Ukrainians insist that the impeachment-related tumult has not shaken their long-term faith in America, and they note the strong voices of support they've received from Congress and from the officials testifying in the impeachment inquiry. And that's worth noting, right? There's a real passion, a real commitment to Ukraine and its well-being and its future from the people testifying that you kind of have to admire no matter where you stand on any of this. But signs of a possible shift are emerging. In other words, Ukraine's traditional reliance on America, signs of a shift are emerging. Quote, one senior European official who works closely on Ukraine policy, European official, said that Ukrainians suffered from a misguided belief that the United States would fix everything. Now, the European official said, Ukrainians ought to finally recognize that the European Union is their closer, more reliable partner. On October 28th, one of Ukraine's business newspapers published a column that concluded with a similar point. Quoting from the column now, it's clear that today, Ukraine's vectors need to be moved closer to a balance of relationships with the leading players, other than Russia, of course, and their less infantile governments, which don't drag other countries into their no-holds-barred political fights, unquote. And I do want to say that I'm not one of these people who thinks American influence should be predominant everywhere, no matter what. It's not necessarily a bad thing for the European Union to have more influence and maybe to carry more of the burden of a Ukrainian alliance, right? But for the US to abdicate its seat at the table, potentially risking Ukraine's well-being through malfeasance at worst and neglect at best, no matter where you stand on this, no matter whether you think that the Russian separatists have valid positions to articulate, and there's a lot of pro-Russian sympathy within Ukraine, so it's not clear what an ideal outcome looks like there. But whatever you think about this, it should be pretty indisputable that America, the American government, the executive branch run by Donald J. Trump, has screwed this up. Okay. I went on way longer than I expected to on a subject that I don't know enough to justify going on that long about. Let's see what you guys have to say now in the chat. And if you're just joining us for the first time, we do this live specifically so that I can react and respond in real time to what you folks have to say in the chat box, which we can really only do live. Okay. Everyone says good morning. Hi, Eve. Hi, Leonardo. Leonardo da Vinci says it's been a while. That's certainly true for Leonardo da Vinci. Felicia Ritter says aloha, Jonathan. Hello. Aloha. It's been a long time since I've been in Hawaii. Fafa says hello, Jonathan. Hello, Fafa. No Middle Ground says I made it. Question: what can be done without war, weapons, or death in Ukraine? They aren't boring. They require an attention span. By the way, rock that beard. Yeah, the beard. Yeah, it's starting to. If you've watched long enough, you know that it comes and it goes. What can be done without war, weapons, or death in Ukraine? Well, peace talks, right? That's what they're doing. That's what they're pursuing. Zelensky right now is trying to make peace talks happen with Putin, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, by the end of this month, or possibly by the end of the year. They're on the path to doing this, and there have been some signs that both sides are willing to step down, their military activity around the Donbass and anywhere else that they're in active conflict. I'm not saying it's entirely over by any means, but they're doing it right now. The problem is that Russia right now, they're not incentivized to participate because they can keep getting concessions without, as long as America is not at the table, as long as America is effectively sidelined, Russia can keep squeezing Zelensky for concessions. Patrick Seguin says, op-ed, Russia's got a point. The U.S. broke a NATO promise, LA Times article. Post the link, Patrick, so people can check that out, myself included. Malbach6 says, Turkey is also hoeing around with Russia. What's the point of that argument? I'm not even sure what that means. We've got a request for help regarding requests for clemency for Rodney Reed. So there's information in the chat box there for people who want to do that. I don't have the facts. I'm trusting that the person posting this has the facts right. Apparently his execution is scheduled for November 20th, less than 6 days from now. Hannah Pause says, hey there, on Tuesday night, the Federal Reserve bailed out the banks with $111 billion. Do you know anything about this nightly process? So I used to, back around 10 years ago when the mortgage crisis first happened. But basically, my understanding is the Federal Reserve provides liquidity with these short-term loans, which I believe get paid back very quickly. So it's not like this money is going out the door in aggregated fashion, just piling on and piling on. I don't think it's quite that bad, but I could be wrong. But basically, the point is that they're providing liquidity so that these massive rich banks don't have to use their own money to place bets. That's my understanding. Hannah Pause says, it has been going on nightly since September 17th. Well, if that's the case, then it's something new and different from what it used to be. So I should probably check that out. Let's see. Daniel Norman says, what basically Putin wants is having a pro-Russian government. That's roughly right. And it's very tempting to sort of think of governments in terms of, well, who's running it? Does he like Russia or not? Governments don't work that way, right? Governments are complicated, messy machines. And essentially what Putin is hoping to do is he's got the Russian virus, let's put it that way, even though that's unnecessarily inflammatory, but he's got this Russian virus. It's concentrated behind the cell membrane in the Donbass, and he's willing to drop that membrane, but then the virus spreads, and to beat the metaphor to death, he weakens, in return, he gets a weakened immune system throughout Ukraine. Hannah, oh, right, sorry. Hannah Pause is asking again about the Fed stuff. Yeah, Hannah, post a link to that so we can check that out. Malbec6 says, Vladimir Putin is the #1 impediment to saving the planet from world-ending climate change. I honestly think violence is inevitable. I'm curious why you think he's the #1 impediment. I'm genuinely curious, not like, really. I'm genuinely curious. If you could elaborate on that or post a link, that would be great. Hannah Pause says, also check out the Jimmy Dore show. Jimmy has done the best job of explaining the loophole in the Dodd-Frank law that permits this. Yeah, I'm sure there's any number of loopholes that are problematic. I've been talking to someone on Wall Street about something that I should be looking into. X-Force waves to the humans. Humans all wave back to X-Force. Francis Wolf says, hello, everyone. Hello, Francis. Malbec6 says, how about them impeachment proceedings? X-Force says that beard is becoming a fire hazard. A clouded mind says, oh, don't belittle his baby beard, even if it is more gray than mine is, LOL. Malbec6 says, of course, destroy alliances by destroying the lines of communication. That's a very succinct way of putting it, something that I was trying to articulate earlier, which is once you establish a back channel, an informal channel of diplomatic channels to another country, that channel doesn't have to succeed in its goals. If your goal is to weaken that other country and to put pressure on them, you've essentially made it impossible for them to rely on you. So just by the creation of the second channel. Hannah Paw says, I wish TYT would explore this. Well, I do too. TYT, in terms of who would explore that, is basically me. I'm a little bit more versed in this stuff than our senior investigative reporter Ken Klippenstein is, and I don't mean that as a slight. I think he would be the first to tell you. And just like, he does his bearings on national security stuff and the intelligence community are a lot stronger than mine are. Francis Wolf says, also X-Force, the beard's making Jonathan look old. Okay. Let's see. Malbec6 says, climate change versus nuclear war 2020. Those were our options. LMFAO. I certainly hope not. We don't have to choose either of them, do we? William Martyr says, I believe you were trying to type, big surprise, Trump has ruined our credibility in the world, literally. X4 says, the U.S. is Dunsky, comrades. Malbec6 says, this is exactly the kind of instability Russia was hoping to foment. Pat Sow, who is that's a name, Pat, I haven't seen before, so welcome to TYTI Daily. Thanks for joining us. If you don't subscribe already, I hope you will. Says, as a Canadian, I would like to start off with saying that these I'm going banter on how powerful and great America is a bunch of BS. I'm not sure I exactly parsed the syntax there, but yes, probably, maybe. Hannah Paz is now yelling at me to investigate the Fed's lending, the overnight lending. I have to imagine someone else has already, Hannah. Do me a favor, send me the links that you're talking about, because it could be that they're already explaining this stuff somewhere in there. But I am curious. Okay, you win. I am curious. That's how we look into things, when we become curious. Malbec6 says, if we're done, I say we go out with a bang. Send the whole military bearing down on Putin. If we lose, so does he. Well, that's terrible. Let's not do that. I understand the sentiment. We've all got a little bit of nihilist in us, right? X4 says, expose the truth. The emperor has no clothes. William Martyr says, Russia lost more people than anyone in World War II by a fair margin. Sure. William Martyr says, or was it World War One? I'm pretty sure it was World War Two. X-Force says the sad outcome of a nuclear war is that Putin and Trump would survive such a thing. Malback 6 talking about Russia says it's good strategy. Clearly they don't want direct conflict. Right. I mean, why would you? They want to get rid of the sanctions. There's a lot of things that Russia stands to gain by ending hostilities with Ukraine. And if they can do so in a way that is a net win, zeros, what am I looking for? What's the phrase I'm looking for? He doesn't lose anything by signing off on a peace deal if it means his influence remains the same. It's just now throughout Ukraine, and now he can chip away throughout the entire country peacefully without losing a single soldier. Clouded Mind says, I doubt that's true since they've openly attacked Ukraine multiple times. Well, both things can be true. You can decide that at this moment, in this place, the most effective thing to do is attack, right? That gets you the thing that you can now negotiate with. You can, if you're totally outside, you've got no leverage, right? The country's got its sovereignty. If you attack just enough to grab a piece of real estate and now sow confusion or even genuine questions about what level of autonomy that region ought to have, and you now have a card for forcing them to give that autonomy, for forcing Ukraine to give the Donbass that autonomy, you don't need to engage in hostility anymore, right? What's the phrase? War is politics by other means. Once you can use the regular norms of politics again, then you do that. It's not that Putin is a pacifist. It's more that there's no payoff and lots of cost if he were to escalate military hostilities in Ukraine right at this moment. Mr. Elder says, you tend to lose a lot of people in a war when you give one a gun and then one only ammo and tell them that when the one with the gun gets killed, the one with the ammo picks the gun up and shoots. All right, I jumped ahead by accident, but I saw a comment that I'm going to have to share. Tressa Ann, first of all, Tressa Ann, I apologize if I'm getting that wrong. I haven't seen your name before, so again, thank you to someone new to this. Says, love your show, 2 exclamation points. How come I can't find you on the TYT app? So, instinct 1, I blame the folks in LA for not putting us on the TYT app. Instinct 2, I blame me for not telling the folks in LA to put us on the TYT app. So, I put my pens away before doing the... I'll make a note. I will make a note to tell the folks in LA that we need to be on the TYT app. Thank you for that, Tressa. Malback 6 says they want to get away with 0 consequences. I think we're back to talking about Russia again. And by the way, I love the fact, like a lot of times when we have these conversations, we end up kind of spiraling off and fractalizing our conversations, which I also enjoy. But when I started this one today, and I see we've only got 48 people watching, which is less than we usually have at this point in the discussion when we're talking about, like, this is what Ambassador Sondland said in his testimony, right? We're deep in the weeds on foreign policy here. So the fact that people are still watching and you guys are still talking about it, that's so encouraging to me, right? It matters. These are other people whose lives matter. And they're concerned, and Russia is telling them that the White House is using them as a pawn, and they're not wrong. Mr. Elder says, governments and old men declare war, the people suffer and the young die. This is a neat little history of the human race. Thank you, Mr. Elder. Malback 6 says, the thing is, it sounds nice. Oh, peace without war. But if that means Russian-style politics gain a foothold in the West, I'd rather stop that instead. And that's what Zelensky, that's exactly the dynamic that Zelensky is confronting right now. What Russia wants is not merely, hey, you need to give these guys a certain degree of autonomy because they have a separate culture and history and what have you. He's asking for something relatively rare in peace talks, which is not just, let's you and I stop fighting, but let's you and I stop fighting. It's as if two people were fighting, right? And let's say there were two of two different religions, and they said, okay, let's just stop fighting. Let's just stop fighting. But as a condition of us stopping fighting, you need to convert to my religion. Right? That's not how peace talks generally work, but that's what Putin is asking for, right? And you can, in theory, bake in special protections for one area, but once you're asking for reform or change in how the entire country is governed, essentially what you're doing is what I tried to articulate earlier. You're trying to weaken the immune system for the non-martial means of shall we say, political interference that Russia likes to practice in other countries. Francis Wolf says, always the poor die in war. Well, who is it who signs up, right? That's who enlists. Jess Love is Louder says, off subject here, John, have you heard anything new or developing on South Bend and Buttigieg? I'm working on stuff. I'm still talking with people, but if there's anything new to report, I'll certainly do an article and a video on it. I'm not likely to talk about it now. There may not be anything there. More recently, I think last week, we published an article about, that was sort of, not tangentially, pretty closely related to a lot of our reporting. A man named Eric Logan, 54 years old, I believe, black man, shot and killed by South Bend police last summer, Father's Day, early Father's Day morning, by a sergeant named Ryan O'Neill in the South Bend Police Department. O'Neill says that Logan came at him with a knife. He was approached while apparently in the commission of a crime, robbing a car. O'Neill's body camera, he had one on him. It was not activated, and so O'Neill is no longer on the force. He stepped down. A special prosecutor is investigating. Buttigieg supported the appointment of a special prosecutor to look into this, which I think is an appropriate, admirable position for him to take. And Buttigieg has taken a lot of heat from the police department, or at least I should say from the Fraternal Order of Police, the union, essentially the union, for not defending police enough, for speaking too aggressively about institutional, systemic racism within police departments generally. Buttigieg has made what I think is an appropriate, has taken an appropriate stance about the necessity to recognize and address systemic racism, endemic racism within police generally. And that's not to say that all individuals who wear blue are racist. That is the opposite of what that is saying. What that is saying is that even black officers within police, any police force, may still be acting in a way that reflects a larger hierarchical, systemic racism through no fault or animus of any of the individual officers. That's what Buttigieg is calling out, and I think he's right about that. I think that's fairly hard to dispute. But the police in South Bend, I would imagine, because it's coming in the context of the Logan shooting, they see that, and again, I can see their position on this as well. They see that as a slam at them. So Buttigieg has paid a political price, at least at home, but potentially nationally, with police for taking that position. So I totally got off track, but to circle back, the family of Eric Logan is filing a lawsuit. We reported this, we actually broke this news last week, that the family's, not that the lawsuit is, the lawsuit we reported on in the summer. What we broke, the news we broke last week, sorry I'm so disjointed at the moment. The news we broke last week was that the lawsuit is issuing subpoenas and using its discovery power to not only seek the secret police tapes that were first revealed in 2012, although we haven't heard them. TYTI reported back in September on what's on those tapes, but the tapes themselves have yet to be released, the audio. So the lawsuit is potentially represents a shortcut to circumventing the legal process or opening up a new legal avenue in federal court to get those tapes, but also, potentially more importantly, The lawsuit is a civil rights lawsuit. In other words, they're not only arguing that you killed Eric Logan, which no one disputes, they're saying you, in doing so, you violated his civil rights, which is a federal crime. And more to the point, they're filing what's known as, I guess, a Monell suit, which alleges that the individual action took place following and as a direct or indirect result of a larger pattern of neglect of racism, which means that now, because they are alleging that, they can and now are beginning to issue subpoenas and take testimony on virtually everything involving the police department and race, which could, the lawyer told me, involve a number of stories that TYT has broken since we first started looking at some of those issues back in March or April. All right, I can literally feel my throat getting scratchy. Oh, and so I'm gonna say goodbye now. But I do want to point out, I missed it in one of these pieces. Apparently Zelensky gave a press conference the other day, an impromptu press conference, which lasted 14 hours. He went before the Ukraine media, and I assume the international media. I mean, literally, you could have gotten on a plane in New York at the beginning of the press conference and showed up for the last quarter of it. 14 hours the guy spoke. So, boy, hats off, man. So with that, I've totally gotten discombobulated talking about South Bend. So, and I've certainly more than exhausted whatever insights I might have about Ukraine. And also, I've been giving marching orders by Hannah Paws now to look into the Federal Reserve's overnight lending. So please take care of each other. Please take care of yourselves. More impeachment hearings tomorrow. We'll be back again tomorrow at 11:30 Eastern here on TYTI Daily. If you're new to us, on Fridays, I usually do Media Analysis Fridays, because what's better clickbait than that? And maybe I'll talk about the media coverage of the impeachment proceedings as theater. I don't know. Maybe I'll be too grinded down by that whole topic by the time tomorrow comes around. But if you've got suggestions, let me know in the comments, and I'll see if there's something that merits me sinking my teeth into it. In the meantime, please take care of each other, take care of yourselves. See you tomorrow here on TYTI Daily. Bye.